Hey, I'm Jammer. So, I've probably mentioned it before in some capacity, but just in case I haven't, I'm a millennial. I was born in 1989, so that kind of puts me right there, I believe, in that period when sort of most millennials are born. I don't know the exact time frame of it, but because, God, who keeps up with that mess? But wherever the case, when I was a younger person, the dress of millennials was kind of well established. It was a holdover from Gen Zers and the grunge era of the 1990s. And it was a pretty basic look. Just about every guy at some point developed a beard, maybe a handlebar mustache or a mustache of some variety. Then, of course, you had to have the t shirt that bore your favorite band logo. I'm wearing mine today. In my case, it's Slipknot. I remain a maggot to my last breath. Stay sick, fuckers. And then naturally, every teenager had to have the flannel top that was unbuttoned and untucked. And then you would normally wear a pair of pretty ratty jeans and some variety of tennis shoes. That's what I remember about being a teenager, and I never really got out of that particular mode of dress. It's the one part about being a teenager that's kind of still there, though I am trying more and more to get rid of graphic tees. My Slipknot shirts will remain in my possession till the day I die, but I am trying to start wearing more monotone clothes, so you might start noticing that more in these videos. What does that have to do with anything? Well, being a teenager, I was a bit of a loser. Uh, hmm. No, let's try another way. I was a nerd. I know, shocker. Well, he can attest to it. But yeah, I was a nerd. I loved listening to Slipknot. I mostly wore black. I didn't really relate to many of the people around me. I just wanted to listen to music and draw or write or read Stephen King books until I, lost my eyesight. That was being a teenager for me. It was more or less a very long period of being a moody outsider. Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's what being a teenager was for me. And I imagine for a great number of people to be like, oh, yeah, I remember that. But for my own part, one of the things that being a teenager kind of taught me, especially now that I'm 31 years old, 32 in a couple months, oh, God, how? Why? Anyway, one of the things that I learned was that one, I didn't know shit. I was an idiot when I was 16 and was 18. Shocker. But one of the other things I kind of learned was that people who tended to sort of romanticize youth or romanticize the period of their high school days as the quote best days of their life were either fundamentally naive, fooling themselves, obviously had no real experience of what real life in high school was like, or else they were romanticizing. They were clearly turning a blind eye to the insecurities, the anxiety, the frustration with authority figures, the disconnect from your fellow human beings, and then, well, you're horny. Like a lot, and everybody around you, particularly if you go to a private Christian school like I did, is telling you, hey, don't have sex, don't even think about sex, don't masturbate either, because you'll get the diseases. And oh, lordy, lordy, were those diseases something to be feared. They wouldn't tell us what they were or show us pictures of them, but, you had to be worried about them. Well, fast forward, I'm 30 years old. I haven't really developed the confidence thing yet, and I'm still a moody loner who doesn't really connect well with people. But at the very least, I've got a nice collection of comics. And what does any of this have to do with comics? Well, today's video I thought would be kind of fun to talk about because as of this taping, it is October 24th. It is 7 days until Halloween. I am stoked to hang out with my lady love and give out candy, what have you. And while I'm doing that, I'm watching a lot of scary movies. And recently, I also decided, you know what, it's time to sit down and just read some sort of just scary books, period. And while I cannot wait to dig into my pile of Junji Ito soon, I thought it would be a little bit interesting to talk about one book that recently came into my local public library, which is Black Hole by Charles Burns. Now, you have probably heard of this book or seen this book somewhere, because if you ever read lists like I tend to do of like best graphic novels of all time, sooner or later this one's going to pop up. Or if you've gone through a Barnes and Noble and you've passed the graphic novel section, you've probably seen the solid red spine with the white letters, or seen this girl looking like a high school portrait with her name blacked out, making her look like a Barbara Kruger masterpiece. Anyway, Black Hole is a pretty popular book. I'm not saying popular the way James Patterson is, but in terms of comics, it's very iconic in its outward construction, and it's reached a very wide audience because of the quality of the artwork that goes into it, as well as the content of the story. Now, Charles Burns is actually somebody we've actually talked about, or I've talked about once on this video before, because if you remember, several months back, at least as far as this taping is concerned, I did a review of this book here, drawn together by Aline and R. Crumb. And in Self-Loathing Comics #2, and yes, before the video started, I put a little note card in it because I didn't want to have to just dig through it like I normally do. There's a passage where Art Spiegelman, aka the Art Spiegelman who wrote and illustrated Mouse, the graphic novel that won a Pulitzer, appears in France to hang out with Art and Robert, and he's joined by a kind of bumbling, bald-headed man with a beard who's sort of stunned by all the endless cross-hatching that's done in the comic. At the time I read it, I didn't know who Charles Burns was, and in fact, I believe I accidentally suggested that this was somebody else who it actually was. So if you're Charles Burns, or a friend of Charles Burns, and you've somehow found this video, my bad, I'm sorry. Please don't at me on Twitter, or do it, that'll get me views, but then you can call me a dick. I earned it. Anyway, what was significant was there was an entire panel where Charles Burns effectively took over the comic, just the way Art Spiegelman did, and drew himself in his own particular style. It's one of the appeals of the drawn together comic book, but what's important here is that if you have ever read anything by Charles Burns, you'll automatically observe how dramatic his visual style is when compared to Aline Kominsky and Robert Crumb. So, we've talked about Charles Burns a little bit on this channel, but tonight, and I'm saying tonight because it's like 8 p.m. when I'm recording this one, I wanted to talk about Black Hole and what was my experience of the book, what is the book essentially about, and why I feel that it's a really solid and substantial book in terms of the medium of comics. So, we've got the sort of general background, nice introduction. Let's talk a little bit about what exactly is Black Hole about in terms of its story and content. Alright, so now that I've done my big long introduction, let's talk a little bit about what is the comic Black Hole about. And I should say this moving forward. I am not the kind of person who cares about spoilers. Like, I really don't care. Somebody could tell me the ending of a story or a movie, what have you. I'm still going to go see it because for me, most of the appeal is I don't really care so much what happens in the story as I want to see how it's told. Because for me, that's usually what's the most interesting part. But at the same time, I recognize not everybody is like that. And in the case of Black Hole, there is kind of like a big sort of reveal, twist, and mystery to the whole thing that does ultimately get resolved by the end of the book. And so I know some people who are like, don't tell me the ending. I'm going to tell you the ending because I don't give a shit about the ending. For me, it's the journey. That sounds super zen, but whatever. If you care about spoilers, go ahead and stop watching the video. We'll wait. We'll wait. Are you gone? Okay. OMG, did you, like, see that top they were wearing? Like, are they for real? Oh god, you're still here. Pretend like you didn't hear that. Anyway, what is Black Hole about? The general concept is that the story takes place sort of outside the region of Seattle in a small suburban American town during the 1970s. And we're talking very small town America, and it focuses primarily around a group of teenagers who all attend the local high school and are in their last year before they graduate. Now, alongside this, we follow the journey of about 3 or 4 primary characters, 2 of the most important ones being a young man named Keith and a young woman named Chris. These 2 have a sort of like continual exchange where they're sort of interacting with one another, and it's one of those Does he like her? Does she like him? Well, she clearly likes him. Does he clearly likes her? Oh, but they're not going to be together because of reasons, what have you. But what's important about Black Hole is it's not necessarily simply a melodrama. One of the interesting things about this particular book is the fact that Charles Burns introduces something really important to his story, namely a plague, which is, well, rather timely given the situation. But plague is probably the wrong terminology for it. The better term is an STI, a sexually transmitted infection. And it's important to state that because some people still use the phrase STDs. There's actually an ongoing conversation in general community and society right now about shifting away from such language because disease has a kind of, how you say, pejorative tone to it. That's its own conversation. Talk to the CDC. In terms of the story of Black Hole, what's important is there is an STI which is traveling through the population of this local high school. And as you can see in this first page, we have a group of sort of normal, average-looking kids, but then the back pages of the book should hopefully inform the reader about what is going to take place. Charles Burns does something rather unique and interesting by creating an STI that is not simply just something like syphilis or herpes. Rather, but at the same time, it borrows heavily from such that. The notion of this particular STI, which never gets a definitive name, it's just simply it, is that ultimately individuals who contract the disease or contract this illness undergo massive physical manifestations for the most part. There are some extreme cases like this particular character here, and then you get characters like the protagonist Chris, who develops a small hole or a small mouth in his neck. And when I mean small mouth, I mean an actual physical mouth. He actually opens up his mouth during several sequences, and you're able to observe. Of course, I didn't take the time and effort to mark it the first time, but nevertheless, here we go. Nevertheless, what's important and observable about this small mouth, and I apologize that I couldn't find a better image right off the bat, that's what I get for not doing my homework, is that it possesses teeth and a tongue, and will actually talk out loud while he's asleep. We also have several other small cast of characters. These are several young teenagers who have been more or less exiled from the immediate community because the outward form of their manifestations of the illness are pretty severe. In one particular chapter, Keith actually encounters a young woman who also has the infection. However, hers manifests in the form of a very large tail growing out of the lower part of her spine. Now, what ultimately is the point of this infection? It's really designed more than simply for just providing a kind of sort of grotesque or sort of horrific depiction, but to sort of tie into the actual horror that one experiences as teenagers. As these characters go about, we receive a series of sort of small vignettes that are oftentimes out of sequence, but sort of continually moving forward. So, while it's not as dramatic as, say, the sequence events of Pulp Fiction, where you have sort of like the middle, and then the ending, and then sort of the middle again, and then the beginning, what have you, you have instead sort of a present moment that's sort of snaking around. We'll get one character's perspective, and then at the end of their story, we'll get another character's perspective that takes place at that same level, and then we might get another character's story who exists at the same time with the original character's story. It can seem at first a little discombobulating, but one of the effective methods of Burns's narrative approach is he manages to keep you focused on around 2 or 3 characters that you become really aware of, and maybe not necessarily attached to, but you begin to sort of understand and empathize with them. Because ultimately, as they progress forward and as their infection develops more and more, you begin to understand and appreciate how he's trying to use the sort of outwardly horrific aspects of this STI to touch into the paranoia that tends to dominate the mentality of a lot of teenagers in the United States. One of the arguably, at least in my opinion, best aspects of this story is it's not just a story about a couple of kids that catch a sexually transmitted infection and then try to go about their lives afterwards, after the fact. it's that he also manages to convey how, especially in small town America, where there's not a lot of opportunity or distraction, aspects like an STI can dramatically impact the way you live in terms of your day to day existence. After these characters contract the illness, their lives are impacted. In one case, a girl actually runs away from home and begins to take up shop in the woods, basically just living out there. Now, one aspect of the story that really needs to be discussed as well is while the STI is one part of the sort of horror of the story, another aspect is there's a mystery because a fair amount of the book takes place in the woods where a lot of these teenagers have effectively had to create a new existence after they've been basically exiled from the local community. And while these characters are often running around in the woods, they tend to encounter little, how you say, what's the correct word for it? Fetishes or little art projects that over time begin to have a very obvious and horrific tone to it. We ultimately discover that one of the teenagers who's sort of fallen prey to the infection has been going around killing some of the other people in town and actually killing some of the other individuals who have the infection. Now, what's important about this part of the story is not simply just the fact that it's an empty jump scare. What's important and unique and interesting, at least to my mind, is the way he also sort of plays on the notion of how the infection heightens a sense of self. This particular character here, whose name is Richard, sometimes referred to as Dick, we observe, or we eventually find out, is that he's the one who has effectively been manipulating this young man here into killing several people and torturing them. But what's really interesting about Dick himself is that he's continually trying to sort of win over a young woman by the name of Chris. She ultimately rejects him, and he eventually goes on a killing rampage. We have to remember the context of this book. This is, though the book is taking place in the 1970s, it's taking place in the United States. It was published, of course I didn't check that out, 2005. So this is a post-Columbine book. And so one of the important things where Charles Burns is trying to bring up in this book is that the alienation and the isolation that can sometimes take place to you in your teenage years, unfortunately, not everybody makes it through that. Some people don't find healthy outlets for their aggression, for their frustrations, for their alienation, what have you. And in the case of the character Dick, he eventually winds up killing not only his whole group of friends, the people who were closest to him before he died, but then ultimately, eventually committing suicide. This is a heavy topic, but it's one that really needs to be addressed, especially when we're talking about the adolescence of individuals living in the United States. I went to a private school, which meant I didn't feel the reality of school shootings or the threats of potential gang situations in public school, but I had friends who went to public school and who did. The fact of the matter is, this is a reality of being a teenager in the United States. And Charles Burns, at least in my opinion, manages to do a really good job of exploring it through the medium of comics in a way that doesn't feel exploitative, but actually manages to sort of say something. Somehow or another, the notion of an STI which creates visible, sort of freakish conditions is only slightly less horrific than being a teenager in the United States. So, in terms of the content of the story, I hope I've told you generally what the story is about. It's about being a teenager in a small town in America and dealing with the horror of your existence and then dealing with a very supernatural disorder. It can be a heavy book in some places, but it never becomes so at the expense of the story. And so, fans of Charles Burns, or even just fans of horror comics period, are going to find something to like in this book. So now, with all of that said, holy crap, this took 11 minutes. It took a lot longer than I thought it would. Let's get into visually and formally why I think Black Hole is really important and why it merits you picking it up at your local comic book shop. Okay, so I've talked now a lot longer than I thought I would about what the graphic novel Black Hole is about in terms of its content. Again, it's exploring adolescence and horror in small town America. In my opinion, a pretty effective way. But again, as always, this channel is dedicated to the notion that we're talking about comics. It's a balance of narrative as well as visual language. So, a story may be good, but we also have to understand and appreciate, is the artist doing something interesting from a visual perspective in terms of strengthening, contributing to, or building a unique visual language. And in the case of Black Hole, without any hesitation, I can say Charles Burns is simply amazing. And I have to say this as well. Though I spent a lot of time talking about the content of the actual story itself, it's truly more in the form of this book that I found most of the satisfaction. I honestly didn't care about most of the story or the characters for myself, but I was still continually driven forward by the simple process or the actual meat of Burns's artwork. In one particular example, the character of Keith has found himself in the home of a local drug dealer. Now, there's a lot of drugs throughout this book, but for the most part, it's pot and LSD. There's not really anything in the way of cocaine, heroin, meth, PCP, or anything like that, because again, we're talking about the later 1970s, marijuana and LSD were still very much the dominant drug of choice in terms of the United States of America. You wouldn't really see the sort of influx of heroin and cocaine to the United States until the later 1970s because of the results of the Vietnam War, and that is a whole thing unto itself. Just Google it. Anyway, in one particular character, Keith finds himself in the home of a drug dealer, and one of the drug dealers is kind of having a bad trip. He starts freaking out and going, "Hey, where you going, man? Where you going, man?" And it's not a terribly dramatic moment, and it doesn't seem like a terribly dramatic moment as emphasized by these panels. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that this is arguably one of the most basic pages of the graphic novel itself, and it still manages to be really visually interesting. There is absolutely no color in this book to speak of. Burns works exclusively in black and white, and that designation is important. It's not a series of grayscales, it's not a series of cross-hatchings the way it is with, say, Robert Crumb. You have an artist who's working primarily with just black and white, and that is expertly executed in this panel. You can see the way he's able to communicate textures, depth, and space in terms of just putting a couple of bodies in the room, and then maybe at the most one or two small details to communicate that they are inside of a house, with just a hint of lighting back here. It's a little thing, but you can see in just these 6 panels how just good Charles Burns is as an artist. He's able to communicate a lot visually throughout the story. But just as much as a simple panel like that is really gorgeous to look at, early on in the book, in fact, the very first chapter, we have a character who's sitting in his biology class having to dissect a frog. And during that point, he was looking, as he says, "I was looking at a hole, a black hole, and as I look, the hole opened up." We see first the belly of the frog, the bottom of a foot, which appears to have a small cut in it. Then we see a woman's back with a rip coming out, what would appear to be a woman's crotch with a hand over it. And then on the next page, just a stunningly gorgeous depiction of disequilibrium, paranoia, confusion, and just a really foul trip. And I'm holding it like this to just let the reader really sink in what Burns is able to accomplish. I think my cats are fighting outside my door. Yep, there's one already. Anyway, when we look at this panel, I really hope you can see again the notion that Burns is able to accomplish a lot using just black and white ink. Whether it's the texture of the hair, the detail and the sort of texture of the skin itself as it's being pulled away, the shadow effect created by sort of dramatic lighting. This book reads a lot like an old horror movie from the 1950s when it was just black and white, but it manages at the same time to be tremendously impactful in terms of your experience. Like, continually, his visual rhetoric is either extraordinarily complex or very, very defined. In a later passage, I think my cats are fighting outside my door. Actually, I'm going to pause it right here just for a second. I will be right back, and hopefully we'll be able to continue. Give me just 1 second. All right. There was a small ruckus involving some catnip and a mouse that had a bell on its tail or something, but it has been resolved. Détente has been achieved. For the moment. Where was I? Ah, yes. In terms of the visual language of Charles Burns, what's really, really, really important and significant is the way he's able to balance the complexity, like the opening page during the biology dissection scene, with a later passage. We have the character of Chris and her boyfriend, whose name, of course, I can't remember, sort of making their way through the woods, and at one moment, Chris cuts her foot on a piece of glass. And we're able to see in this passage right away, again, it doesn't seem like a terribly dramatic panel layout. Again, this page is very sort of basic when compared to other passages in the book. But what's really important, again, is the way Burns is able to sort of communicate the flesh, he's able to communicate the wounds, and just the sort of raw carnality that is disease and damage to the physical body, and he does so by focusing on these small details while allowing the narrative of the plot to sort of further enhance the drama. There's so many stunning pages in this book. For example, in a later passage, Chris decides to take a little bit of LSD, and you can see just in this page alone the construction that is taking place. If you are not an artist, you may not appreciate just how intimidating a page like this can be, but really take in a moment and observe the fact that these white spaces and these gutters had to be laid out before you began to actually fill them in with the meat and content of the artwork itself. And in the very next page, again, we see an effect that Burns employs throughout the main body of the text, which is these sort of rippling, diagonal in some instances, but just kind of jerky panels. We have gutters that are wobbly, and that's significant because, again, we have a character who's undergoing an acid trip, so we have to create and establish a dreamlike perception within the reader. And so while he may, in certain instances, have possibly employed a sort of surrealist aspect to the artwork, again, it's using the basic tools of the medium. It's using the medium itself to communicate to the reader, non-verbally in this instance, to say, hey, this character is experiencing some shit right now. And that's important because, again, makers and readers of comics have to understand that artists and cartoonists, when they're making graphic novels, they have a wealth of visual language to communicate to the story as well. And given the fact that Black Hole has plenty of extraordinarily horrific as well as, what's the right word for it, hallucinatory moments, that language is really strengthened and communicated through the tools of the panel layouts themselves. And possibly, I think this will just be the last example that I'll employ, but in a later passage, when Chris's boyfriend is sort of being pursued through the woods and sort of having his own trip, you can see the sort of horror he's experiencing when he encounters one of the sort of weird fetishes, when he encounters the immensity of the woods, when he has sort of a vision of his own death, dismemberment, and torture. What we have here is an extraordinarily tense sequence, and Burns has heightened that up by, in several instances, creating really small panels that in this instance we have to remember are sort of like aspect to aspect. Nothing is really being told in these two panels where we see just branches and trees and the moon and parts of his head. We don't see anything really in terms of dramatic action, but instead it helps us feel the action, feel the tension that's sort of settling over us as we're like, dude, get out of the woods, dude, get out of the woods, dude, get out of the woods. He dead. He dead. It's bad. He dead. But along with it, he does something that I think is really great in that he tucks the words right there into the gutters so that even in the moments where the reader's supposed to be achieving closure by imagining what's happening, he's still invading your space going like, nope, you're not going to get a relief here. Nope, you're not going to get a relief here. And he continues on the other page, not to the same extent as he did in the original one, but again, he employs sort of small, jerky moments within the panels to heighten the tension. The strength, again, of Black Hole is the fact that it really manages to convey a lot of the horror of adolescence and just a lot of just general horror, period. But it's in the visual language that I really feel that Charles Byrne excels in this book. He makes a really great mystery and a really great horror story by primarily just using his artistic skill to really make the reader just feel really, really, really uncomfortable, sometimes in the most simplest of ways. And that, at least in my mind, truly conveys his ability as a cartoonist. This is a wonderful graphic novel, and anybody who has any, just even passing interest in making comics or reading comics or appreciating comics, studying comics, really needs to sit down and tackle this book, for it's just really expertly deft, wonderful, super badass, uber cool artwork. Check out Black Hole. It's great. And now with that said, let's do the last hurrah and call it a day. All right. You okay, man? You all right? It's okay. We're done talking about the scary stuff. You can come out now. Cookie Monster got a little scared. Don't worry, dude. We're good. We're good. What were we talking about? Oh, yes. So, Black Hole by Charles Burns. What's it about? It's about a group of teenagers who discover that there is a sexually transmitted illness passing through town which causes massive physical deformities, which then in turn causes social exile as well as just a loss of personal conception of self. And then on top of that, there's a sort of string of murders that sort of ravels or sort of runs throughout the course of the book before ultimately becoming a sort of definitive plot point. And then, in terms of the visual language, Black Hole is simply stunning. Not only for the fact that Burns is able to communicate so much depth in terms of just a plain black and white style, but also in his execution of panel layouts, panel construction, and then the balance of narrative developments in prose as well as just small key visuals that heighten a lot of dramatic tension. Black Hole is just a study in itself of what can work when a cartoonist is doing his job right. And in the case of Black Hole, he does it stunningly. Like, hopefully, again, if I'm dedicating a half hour to a book, hopefully that's enough to convince you to tell you, this is a book that's definitely worth your time. So, go ahead, go to your local Barnes & Noble. Actually, no, go to your local comic book shop. Pick up a copy of this book. You won't be disappointed. Alright, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you're still with me, thank you. This video was way longer than I thought it could be, but that's just the trend with these things. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're liking these and that you want to see more. In terms of Black Hole, if you're interested in reading this book, it's a pretty popular one. I guarantee you, if your local comic book shop doesn't have a copy of it, they can probably place one on order for you, because this book stays relatively in print, and this is Pantheon, the same company that puts out Marjane Satrapi, so, like, it should be available, but double check, because sometimes books go out of print. Likewise, your local public library can probably has a copy of it, because it's a pretty popular book, and there's some schools that will even assign it for, like, classes, what have you. And if they don't have it, please, please, please do not forget, your library card will get you access to an interlibrary loan form, in which case then you can just borrow it from another library. Is there anything else I was going to say? Again, I don't know when this particular video is going to air. Again, I've got an idea for a video for the Halloween, because sometimes I like to be topical, but whenever this airs, just have a happy Halloween. Hope your year is going safe, and seriously, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.